just while you're thinking, I just want to introduce you to Scott Higgins. Scott, come up here with me. So this is Scott. Give Scott a welcome.
Hi.
So Scott was one of our keynote speakers at the conference. And Scott, firstly, welcome to Enfield Baptist.
Thank you.
This is Father's Day, and we're so glad that you gave up your Father's Day to come here and share with us. But you shared with me a couple of things. You said you'd like to tell the people here who are essentially the hosts of the conference, but what was your heart saying through conference?
Yeah. From a speaker perspective, I've been to a lot of conferences, and I've got to say the Life 4 conference was probably the best organised and best catering for the speakers I've ever been to. It was extraordinary. Thankfully, we even had a little room upstairs, always well supplied with foods and stuff. That was really great. I found I loved the way the conference integrated the sort of the stuff of the heart with, getting out in the community and justice and mercy. Thought that was quite extraordinary. But for me, the highlight was the worship session, particularly on the Friday night. I'm going to share a little bit more than probably I told you, John, because it's I'm not much of a touchy-feely kind of person. I'm not into God speaking to me all the time, and you may, those of you at the conference know I shared I have Parkinson's, and so basically at the moment I'm doped up high on my medications, so that I'm able to move freely. But like the day before the conference, I have periods where I just freeze up and my body tremors. And so the day before the conference, I spent 2 hours lying on the bed at my host's place, just shaking and not able to do anything. And that's sort of becoming more common, and my muscles freeze up. And to be honest, the day of the conference, I was thinking, I think this might be it for me. I'm not sure I can keep doing this. And then that worship session, damn you. It was just extraordinary for me. It was like I've never been as aware in a worship time of the presence of God to me as I was then. And when we sang that song, the one about remembering, and it's got this line in there that says, I forget, how does the chorus go? The last line in the chorus, it's something about God's not finished with me yet. And it was like God just spoke straight to my heart. Said, no, keep going because I'm not finished with you yet. So I don't know whether to thank you or curse you, but it was a really profound, a deep moment for me. So I want to thank you for that. It was extraordinary.
Thank you, Scott. While Scott's here, Scott is a leader in our National Baptist movement. You may or may not know of Scott. I've seen and intersected with Scott across many of the places that I go internationally, and Scott's usually there. And he has been a leader in our Baptist World Aid movement. He has been a leader on the Asia Pacific area for Baptist work, internationally through Baptist World Alliance. He is now overseeing Just Cause, which is a ministry of the Australian National Baptists. Whatever we need to think about when we want to think about justice and social action, Scott's the person our hearts and minds go to first, because he's written enormous amounts on this. Coming up shortly, Scott's going to be bringing together advocacy with senators and parliamentarians and everyone with the Baptist leaders around our nation, coming to Canberra and meeting with people face to face. We heard of some ways and means of taking action over the conference, and I just want to say this man I've seen take probably more action than I've seen any other person take in our Baptist movement. And Scott, I just want to thank you for that. And I don't think God's finished with you yet. And certainly all of the different things you've written and have shown influence in, we embrace it, we take that on, and he'll never be finished with what you've done. So I just want to thank you so much for that and just bless you, and may God strengthen you in every good thing.
Cheers. Thanks, John.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much for having me here, and thanks again to the band. That was wonderful. I was down in South Australia a couple of years ago, and I took advantage of the time to fulfil one of my bucket list dreams, which was to go diving with the great white sharks off Port Lincoln. So I did that, and I went to these two churches and shared on the Sunday night. You always share something about, say, I love being here in your town, and I really did. The shark dive was astonishing. I was in the water for over an hour with bars between me and these great whites, and you could They're so close you could reach out and touch them. The longest one was over 5.5 metres. Massive creatures, amazing. I've had a fascination all my life. And I went along to these churches and said this, and I said, who's been out to the shark's dive? And no one put their hand up. They all just looked at me as if to say, you're an idiot. So I didn't do that this time. But thanks for having me here. It's been wonderful being at this conference, like I said. Unexpected ministering to me, as well as an opportunity for hopefully meet and minister with you. I grew up in a family, we're here on Father's Day, and I grew up in a family where I had a great mum and a great dad. I was very fortunate. A lot of Australian kids don't get that. A number of you here in this church may have grown up in environments where you didn't have that. And, it's my prayer that if that's been your case, that you'll find family in other ways in the church and in other people, but that you'll learn the things that we need to learn from family. So I want to tell you about Christmas in my family as I was growing up. We were the sort of kids who, our hearts were very full of anticipation of what we might be receiving for our presents. 3 o'clock. Is it time? Is it Christmas yet? Go back to bed. When the light comes up, you can come in. And so we'd sit at our windows. And the moment a ray of sunlight peeks through the skies, we were into Mum and Dad. It's Christmas time, it's Christmas time. And all our bedrooms are upstairs in our house. So Mum and Dad go, oh, okay, let's get up. And we would race down the stairs. And we had our lounge room at the bottom of the stairs. And there were 4 lounge chairs in our lounge room. And there were 4 of us kids. And each one of us would have a chair assigned to us, and our presents would be sitting on that chair, and we'd quickly scan the room to figure out which was yours. And here it was, and you race over, and for the next few minutes, all you'd see is this sound of paper ripping. When I got married to my wife Sandy, I went to her family's place for Christmas, and I was shocked because they were so careful with the wrapping paper. Fold it, put it aside, so you think, blow that! We just rip the stuff apart, open boxes, you hear shouts, woohoo, I'm just what I want, this is fantastic, unreal. And so, balls flying through the air, and there's toys going up and down the hallway, and there's batteries being put in things, and switches being flicked, and so exciting. And then there was Christmas 1979. Our annual celebration of wantonly expended disposable income took us down into that the lounge room, and I'm just getting excited, ripping things up when we hear this wail and moan. And it's come from my brother Barry. An Evel Knievel stunt set? You've got to be joking. And his tears start welling. Barry's 13 years old, and there's no greater insult than to give a 13-year-old boy a present that has for ages 8 to 12 on the box. It's 13, that age when you're growing out of childhood and into manhood. You're wanting to impress that special someone who's captured your heart this week. You're desperately scanning your face for the remotest sign of some kind of facial hair because Bob in your class reached puberty at the age of 10 and he's got a full-grown beard, and you think that you're not really going to be a man until you've got one of those. And then you get an Evel Knievel stunt set. And in your Christmas gifts, instead of getting something that's going to propel you into manhood, you get something that just drives you back into childhood. Mum and Dad did their best to redeem the situation. Come on, Barry, it might be good. Let's get it set up and see how it works. So for the next half hour, the whole family's feverishly erecting this Evel Knievel stunt set. You remember Evel Knievel, that motorcyclist, who'd jump things? And so it has a ramp set up over here. And there's another ramp set up over here. And you come back here, and then you get the Evel Knievel little action figure. It's a motorcycle with an Evel Knievel doll on it. And that was a hard one for my dad. His boy's playing with dolls, but nevertheless. You put it in this launcher, and the idea is that you flick the switch, and Evel Knievel will set off up over this ramp, through the air, and down, landing safely. Well, we're all waiting with bated breath. This could be the moment our Christmas morning 1979 is redeemed. My brother Barry flicks the switch. Nothing. And then Evel Knievel just falls over. You can see tears starting to well in his face. Dad says, don't worry, it might just not have been packed in properly. So we put it back in, we make sure it's clamped in properly, it's connected in. Flicks the switch. I'm 13! And this is for kids aged 8 to 12 and it doesn't even work. Well, we spent the rest of the day recovering, helping Barry to recover something of the joy of Christmas and the rest of us to do the same. I don't know if you've had experiences like that for your Christmases. But whenever we get together for Christmas now, it's 40 years on from that, and the story comes out every year. I think it's embellished a bit more every year. And we remember, those times we've had together, those times that there's been just disasters that you now laugh at, those really good times and important times in our lives. And for us, for the last few years, it's been more poignant because Dad died a couple of years ago, and so it brings back memories of Dad and what he and Mum taught us. And it strikes me as we remember on that, what we're actually remembering is not particular episodes. Well, we're remembering particular episodes, but the significance of those is they're all part of a big narrative that ran through our lives where Mum and Dad taught us what it is to be human beings. Taught me what it is to be a man. Taught my sisters what it is to be women. And taught us all what it is to be decent human beings. We weren't perfect. Who would buy an Evel Knievel stunt set for an 8 to 12-year-old, for a 13-year-old that's made for 8 to 12? So we made mistakes along the way, but the narrative of my life with my parents was they actually showed me, I think, what it means to be human, pointed me in a direction. And for a while I was going to say, and it was all about them showing me how to be a man, but I think when they showed me how to be a man and how to grow up into a good and decent man, they were actually saying it's not so much about masculinity or femininity. It's about being a human being. Whether it's male or female, being a decent, good, Jesus-following human being. And the thing they gave me, I haven't adopted all their ideas of what it means to be manly or not. Some of those things have got shaved off over the years. My dad was, like most men of his age, not emotionally very self-aware. So we didn't express the tender emotions very often. We knew we felt them, but some rule of manhood said you don't express them. Well, my kids get smothered now. I tell them I love them every night before we go to bed. I hug my 16-year-old son, much to his dismay, still these days, and we have a very tender, much more expressed tenderness than we did in my family. So there's areas that in my understanding of manhood I've developed and moved on. But what my parents gave me was this sense that I need to understand who I am as a human being and as a man in the light of Jesus and following the way of Jesus. And that's been my journey for for all of my life, really, I think. I'd like to take a look at a story this morning that perhaps is not so familiar to us in terms of thinking about manhood. And I've just realised I put my phone, which I have the text on, in my pocket. So give me 2 seconds to open it. And it's a story that I'd like to spell out for you some of the background to it before we actually then get into the text itself. It's from Matthew 21, and it goes like this. I should just put this in context. Jesus had finished his ministry in Galilee, 3 years of ministry in the Galilee, and he's now turned to Jerusalem for the last time. So they're on their way to Jerusalem, and this is headed Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. When they'd come near Jerusalem and had reached Bethphage at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied to a colt, and a colt with her, a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says to you, just say this. If anyone says anything to you, just say this, the Lord needs them." It's pretty interesting, don't you think? Go ahead into a village, find a colt, donkey and a colt together, and just untie them and take them. And if anyone says, "What on earth are you doing?" "Oh, the Lord needs them." And he will send them immediately. This took place to fulfill what the prophet had been spoken through the prophet, saying, "Tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." the disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. I figure they'd learned enough over the years, and he told them to do some pretty crazy things and seemed to work out. They brought the donkey and the colt and put their cloaks on them, and Jesus sat on them. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him and that followed were shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest heaven." When he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was in turmoil, asking, "Who is this?" The crowds were saying, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee." Then Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who were selling and buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. He said to them, "It is written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers.'" The blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he cured them. Okay, a couple of things we need to understand to really get this passage in context is that the setting for this is the Passover, period of Passover. Every year the Jewish people had a whole number of festivals they celebrated, and one of the most important was Passover. And for Passover, you would have thousands and thousands upon pilgrims coming from all over the nation into the capital city of Jerusalem in order to celebrate the Passover. They came to commemorate that time when God, generations ago, had liberated their forefathers from slavery in Egypt and brought them to the new land. The story would be repeated over and over, much like I think every Christmas we tell the story of the Evel Knievel that didn't work stunt set. They tell this story, a much more important story, over and over, of the bitterness, helplessness of their ancestors against the might of the greatest superpower of the time, of the bitterness of their life as slaves, of the battle between Yahweh, who had come to their aid, and the supreme ruler of Egypt and the gods who stood behind him, of Pharaoh's unwillingness to free the slaves, and Yahweh's escalating acts of judgment until Pharaoh finally breaks and says, "Get on your way." They tell of Pharaoh's change of heart, of how all of a sudden the people saw the armies of Egypt coming after them. And just as terror and fear were striking them, tearing them apart, God opens the sea and they pass through. And they would tell of this time when God brought them from oppression, the yoke of the foreign oppressor, into freedom as his people. That made Jerusalem in Passover week a very, very dangerous place. Because every time they told that story, the subtext was, we are now also under the yoke of a foreign oppressor, the greatest superpower of our age, the Empire of Rome. They ruthlessly oppress us and make our lives bitter. But our God will come, Yahweh will come, and he will overturn them, and he'll restore his reign. So it was a politically seditious environment. Very dangerous. It's the whole city, we're told by the historians of the time at Passover, would be like a tinderbox ready to set ablaze. And if rebellion was going to break out anywhere, it would break out then. It's the first thing we need to know. This is background is the Passover festival. The second thing you need to know to understand Jesus' entry into Jerusalem is that at the same time that Jesus was entering Jerusalem, the Roman governor was entering from another side of the city. The Romans knew that Jerusalem was a tinderbox. It was a potential threat of sedition and rebellion during the Passover. So the governor, who would normally live elsewhere in Israel, would at the start of Passover have a massive procession into the city. And he would come through the gates. He'd be sitting atop his war horse. He'd have usually up to 2,000 or 3,000 Roman troops with him, most disciplined military force of history to that point. They would march through the city. There'd be trumpets blaring. There would be a delegation of the Jewish leaders who would have to come out and meet them and say, we will be subservient to you. That was taking place. That was what happened every year, just about the same time Jesus was starting his little procession into Jerusalem. And I think what the gospel writers want us to see is this absolute contrast between the construction of what it meant to be human that came through the Roman Empire and the construction of what it means to be human that comes through to King Jesus. Completely distinct entrances. So when Pontius Pilate came in, atop his war horse, surrounded by troops, it was a projection of power. It was a projection of Rome's enormous power over the world. It was a reminder of Rome's violence. It was a signal that said, you might be remembering these traditions of your God, but just remember who is God. It's not your God, Yahweh. It's Caesar. And just be aware that if you dare to rebel against what Caesar says, we will cut you down faster than you can blink your eyes. And people knew this was true because the Romans regularly did it. We know that around the time of the birth of Jesus, King Herod, who had until that time was king over all of Israel, died, and the Jewish people sent a delegation off to Caesar, and they said, "We don't want another king. We don't want any of his sons as our king," because Herod was just a ruthless and bloody master. He took life. He shed blood. During his reign, it was a reign of terror. There were people all throughout the land, spies, anybody who said anything seditious would be reported back to Herod, and people just disappeared. Their money was stripped from them. It was an awful time. It was a horrible rule. And they sent people off to the delegation and said, please don't give us one of his sons as our ruler, anybody but Herod's sons. While they were off there, a bit of a rebellion broke out in Sepphoris, which is about 12 kilometres from Capernaum, where Jesus spent a lot of time. And the Romans came in, sent an army in. They scorched all the lands of northern Galilee. They marched into Sepphoris. They literally pulled it to the ground. They took 2,000 of the people who'd been the leaders of the rebellion and participated in the rebellion and crucified them. There were 2,000 crosses with people strung up on them up and down the roads. And then the rest of the population of Sepphoris, they took and made slaves and sold them to places across the world. And everybody knew that story. It happened to one of their family members. It happened to one of their friends. And episodes of violence like that, when Pilate marches in atop his war horse with his soldiers, projecting force and power, everybody knew, keep quiet or else. Submit or else. The Romans came in, and you know why they were there? Why are occupying armies ever in other countries? Greed. They were systematically stripping Galilee and Judea of their wealth. That's the way it worked. They would put these huge tax burdens on the people, and they were so great that people would go bankrupt paying them back, but the wealth would all flee back to Rome. And unlike our countries where you pay taxes and you get services in return, you paid your taxes here and you got nothing in return other than Roman violence. So this is what's going on, right, at the start of Passover. Now hear the story of Jesus again. Jesus is going to Jerusalem, and he's coming as her true king. And he says, go and find a donkey. Bring it back here. And he sits on top of the donkey. And he enters Jerusalem. It kind of makes you wonder, is he actually parodying what's happening with Pilate? But he comes in, and it says this to fulfill what the prophet wrote. If you go back to the Old Testament prophecy, it talks about Jerusalem, your king will come to you riding on a donkey, and he will bring peace. And there will be no more war horses or chariots in Jerusalem. And he'll bring peace across the land. So Jesus is making a really calculated point here, saying, I am the true king. I ride into Jerusalem on this donkey in fulfillment of this prophecy to say the time for Pilate and his war horses are coming to an end. The time for those Romans and their weapons are coming to an end. Because the true king is here. Now, that's a very, very dangerous thing to do. And then what happens? Well, they've prearranged for some people to greet him We know they've prearranged for people to greet him because they've come with palm branches from out in the fields already. And as he walks in, they're going, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna, Hosanna. Here is the Son of David." They were the statements you used to acclaim the King of Israel. Now you understand why the Pharisees said, "Please shut them up." They didn't want the violence of Rome. But Jesus comes to Israel as its true king, gentle and humble and riding on a donkey. Jesus' vision of what it means to find your way in this world and to be fully and truly human. It's not wrapped up with projecting power. It's not wrapped up with projecting violence. It's not wrapped up with demanding you get what you want. It's not wrapped up with exploiting and oppressing people. It's wrapped up with gentleness and humility and service and standing with those who are vulnerable and weak. And the next thing that happens is what? He rides into the city, and then where does he go? The temple. And the temple's kind of got this funny dual significance in Israel in the first century. It's of course significant because it stands for the presence of God. When the people saw the temple, it was a reminder, God is with us. God has redeemed us. God is going to be involved in our future. We might be under foreign oppression now, but we can trust our future to God. So it was a symbol of hope. But it also became a symbol of oppression because it was the centre, the temple was the centre of the operation of the Jewish economy. And you had this whole system set in place that the leaders of Israel, the Sadducees in particular, we're told had instead of resisting Rome's taxes and shifting of all the wealth back to Rome, had actually colluded in it. And they were growing rich off the back of it. And so, you go back to the Old Testament law and it's got this idea that, if we're the people of Israel, we've all got our own little plot of land. We're all able to subsist on that. We're all healthy. We're all able to have what we need to survive and to enjoy community life together. And the Old Testament has all these laws to stop that from eroding, laws that to stop people from losing their property, to stop, one group of people from amassing huge amounts of property so they have all this power and control over everybody else. Well, that's gone out the window by the time of Jesus. And you have these leaders who have large, massive estates and they've got rich on the backs of the poor. That's the only way you could get rich in ancient Israel, was to take land off the poor. And it's happening more and more and more, and history records tell us there's more and more resentment about it. In fact, 30 years later, when the revolution broke out against Rome, the first thing the rebels did was to go into the temple and burn the land records, because it meant they could get land back. So you had this Jewish leadership that's colluded in this oppression of the people. And Jesus comes in and he says, "You have made my temple," what? "A den of robbers. It was to be a house of prayer for the nations. You have made it a den of robbers." Think about it, a house of prayer for the nations. The whole idea of the way God had structured Israel was that people would look at what was happening and go, if that's what it's like under the reign of Yahweh, we want some of that. But instead they'd gone off track and they'd become just like the nations and had no longer been any value to point to the reign and the rule of God. And then Jesus says, "You've made it a den of robbers." Now that's a really interesting phrase. I used to always think that Jesus was, gone into the temple and he's walking around and he's seen the oppression, he's seen the money changers ripping people off, and he's getting angrier and angrier and angrier, till finally he just burst in an outrage. He just turned over the tables and he's got a whip and chased people out, and very violent, uncontrolled act. I actually think it's nothing like that. I think it's a very prepared and pre-planned prophetic act. The prophets had this tradition of doing these dramatic acts to draw attention to things. Now, Jesus says you made it a den of robbers. A den is not where the crime is committed. A den is the place the robbers go to after they've committed their crime for safety. That makes sense? So what I think is going on here is that Jesus is actually critiquing the leadership of Israel, who are exploiting and oppressing the poor, stripping them of the land, sending them into poverty, and then coming back to the temple and sitting in it setting up all their nice little trading systems where they trade their ill-gotten gain and saying, we're safe. We're safe here because God is on our side. And Jesus' prophetic action is designed to say, think again. God's not on your side because what you're doing is the exact opposite of what he calls us to be. And a time will come when he will judge you. Jesus' vision for human being is not simply that we're gentle and humble and kind and compassionate. It's that then translates into standing on the side of those who are being exploited and oppressed and trodden down and calling for God's justice. Father's Day, I want to say to the men here, which vision of manhood, of humanhood are you embracing? What are you teaching your kids? What are you modelling to them? The way of Rome, or the modern version of it, which is kind of be a nice person but get as much as you can? Or the way of Jesus, which is humility, compassion, grace, generosity, the rejection of violence and the embrace of love? Does that make sense? Ladies, I'd like to say the same thing to you. I don't think there's Jesus doesn't have an idea of sort of masculinity is different to femininity in the Gospels. It's all one and the same. We're all to be like him. How are you embracing it? How is the church you embracing it? I saw some great things in LifeWell that's happening. So I want to encourage you to keep on that track if that's where you're going. But there's Father's Day and every day after it. Keep asking yourself, where am I? How am I embodying this vision of humanity as being like Jesus and living it out to the world around us, to be compassionate and kind? And it's difficult to be compassionate and kind. And for our households to be places that embody this. Help us to stand alongside the downtrodden, the lowly and the poor, and to recognise that in doing that we are being fully and completely human. And may we in this church project such an attractive humanity through LifeWell, through the various ministries of the church, through the way we conduct ourselves in our homes. Such a glorious vision of humanity that people will say, I want part of that. And for those households that are struggling, trapped in a model of violence, power and demand that marked the Roman Empire, we pray that you would grant them the courage to find their way out and the resources and help they need to do so. Amen.